Now, in looking at last week's discussion, we were trying to focus on the idea of multimedia storytelling and how that is executed through popular media websites. Some of you really hit on this idea, and some of you are more focused on just looking at the layout. And I think that this might be due to the emphasis in this class on just evaluating how information is laid out and presented. Last week, though, we were really wanting to dig into this idea of multimedia storytelling. That is, how do we take the toolbox, and I'm speaking about the toolbox that appears on page 209 in our text, that multimedia context toolbox. How do we select tools as digital editors to really tell a story, to evoke an emotional reaction or response from bringing together these different elements, and how that's different from just having a picture with some text or just text with no picture. There were some interesting comments that came out of the conversation that are related to digital media storytelling. And that is this concept of having slideshows at the top of the page. A lot of websites have gone this way, whether they are media or business-based. And that's because a slideshow gives you the ability to bring another layer of animation and give readers or viewers a choice in what they're looking at. And the concept of choice came up in the conversation as well. But then some of you also noticed that you were more likely to pay attention or click on something or make a decision if pictures were paired up with a headline. And that gets at the storytelling effect as well. Not just the layout, but is there a picture that goes with this headline that makes me want to feel connected to it and learn more about it? But then some of you also talked about the difference between the print version of a media outlet and the web version. And that's interesting because we'll be talking about that a little bit with this week's topic. But related to storytelling, some of you noticed how it was easier for a story to be told in a web version because they had more multimedia tools available. Some of you also noticed that the mobile design took away or added to versus taking away, or vice versa, depending on the source. I did find it interesting that The Onion was referenced. It's one of my favorite satire websites, and I found it interesting that it seemed that some of our classmates weren't as familiar with The Onion and did not realize that it was a satire website at first. The Onion is probably one of the oldest in the field. It did begin as a print-based paper, in the 80s. I remember reading it print-based in the early 90s when I was an undergraduate, and then it went web version, and I don't think I've seen a print version since. But The Onion tends to lead in satire news, not to be confused with fake news, which doesn't necessarily take into account the satire effect. But last but not least, this kind of came up in a couple of different posts. Clickbait. As a design feature, clickbait does an outstanding job of multimedia storytelling. It's trying to give you an emotional reason to click on a link and find out what information is being presented. Personally, not a fan of clickbait. I refuse to click on clickbait. But as a designer, I have to appreciate how clickbait comes about. I do want to call your attention, though. On screen, you can see an animated loop of one website that was brought up, and this is an outstanding example of multimedia storytelling. As you scroll through the content, different types of media are brought together to give you a better way to interact with and become immersed with the content, as opposed to a traditional news story or even just a video. It's more interactive than that. This is a great example, and I'm so glad that it was shared. So I wanted to highlight it and call your attention back to that post in case anybody wanted to revisit the topic of multimedia storytelling and how it's different from just regular layout. So all of that said, let's take a look at this week's topic. Use the on-screen navigation to access another section of this week's overview.